The evening air carried the scent of jasmine as the city's wealthiest families gathered in the grand halls of the Moreno estate. Chandeliers dripped with light, casting golden reflections against marble floors, and the echoes of laughter and clinking glasses painted an atmosphere of careless indulgence. In the quiet corners of the house, far from the grandeur, Isabella moved like a whisper. Her faded uniform blended with the dimly lit corridors, and her steps were practiced in their silence. A housemaid in the Moreno household, she had learned to become invisible, to serve without being seen, to listen without being heard. It was safer that way. She adjusted the tray in her hands, steadying the weight of empty crystal glasses as she made her way to the kitchen. Beyond the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom, music swelled, a symphony of violins and delicate notes, the kind of sound meant for people who belonged in a world she could only observe. Inside the kitchen, the staff bustled. The cook shouted orders, silver trays clattered, and the scullery maids rushed to clear dishes before the next course. Isabella set her tray down and reached for another, her mind already lost in routine. But just as she turned, a voice startled her. "You always do that when you think no one is watching." Her hands froze over a stack of napkins. Slowly, she looked up and met the amused gaze of Julian Moreno, the young heir to the estate. His perfectly tailored suit barely concealed the arrogance that dripped from every word. Isabella averted her gaze immediately, lowering her head in a practiced motion of submission. "I don't know what you mean, sir," she murmured. Julian leaned against the counter, watching her with interest. "You hum when you work. Do you even notice? It's like you have music trapped inside of you." A cold thread of fear ran down Isabella's spine. Had he heard her? She had always been careful, only letting the notes slip out in hushed breaths while folding linens or polishing silverware. Her singing was a secret. Something delicate and precious like an heirloom kept locked away. "You must be mistaken," she whispered, gripping the napkins tightly. Julian smirked, unconvinced. "Maybe, or maybe you're hiding something." His voice lowered to a conspiratorial tone. "Tell me, Isabella, what else can that voice of yours do?" Her stomach twisted. The rich had a way of turning people into entertainment, and she could already see the dangerous glint of amusement in his eyes. She forced a polite smile. "I should return to my duties, sir." But as she tried to step past him, he blocked her path with ease. "The charity gala is tomorrow night," he mused. "Father is entertaining important guests. He always complains about how dreadfully boring these events are." His eyes gleamed with mischief. Maybe it's time for something unexpected. Isabella frowned, unsure where this was going. "Sir?" Julian leaned in slightly, his voice teasing, yet firm. "Sing for us tomorrow night. Entertain the guests. Give them something to talk about." The very idea sent a shudder through her. She shook her head adamantly. "I can't. Please, I'm just a maid." His chuckle cut her off. "Nonsense. You'll do it." Then, before she could protest further, he added with an air of casual cruelty, "After all, I've already placed a bet." Isabella's breath hitched. "A bet?" she echoed. Julian's grin widened. "I made a little wager with some of the guests. They don't believe a housemaid could possibly hold a voice worth hearing. But I told them, no, I insisted, that you would be extraordinary." The room felt suddenly smaller, her pulse roaring in her ears. A pawn. A joke for the rich to amuse themselves with. She swallowed hard. "And if I refuse?" Julian raised an eyebrow. "I suppose I could tell your employer you've been slacking." His tone was light, but the meaning was clear. Refusing him meant risking everything, the small scraps of stability she had worked so hard to protect. Isabella's throat tightened. Tomorrow, in front of the most powerful families in the city, she would have to stand on a stage meant for performers and force herself to sing, knowing that laughter, not applause, awaited her. What had once been her greatest secret was about to become her deepest shame. The evening arrived far too quickly. Isabella stood in front of the old, chipped mirror in the servants' quarters, her breath shallow, her hands trembling as she fastened the buttons of her plain dress. There would be no silk gowns for her, no jewels glittering at her throat. While the guests above adorned themselves in luxury, she remained a housemaid, a shadow in their world. Except tonight, she would be forced into the light. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Marisa, the eldest of the kitchen maids, peeked in, her brows knit with worry. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. A bitter smile ghosted across Isabella's lips. "I do. You're not some puppet for their amusement. If I refuse, I lose my place here," Isabella murmured. Julian made sure of that. Marisa sighed, stepping forward to squeeze her hands. "Then sing, but not for them," she urged. "Sing for yourself. Make them regret underestimating you." Regret? Isabella almost scoffed at the thought. The rich never regretted their cruelty. But a spark of defiance, buried deep beneath years of submission, flickered to life. Marisa gave her a final nod and slipped out, leaving Isabella to gather herself. Her heart pounded with each step she took toward the grand hall, a hollow ache forming in her chest. As she reached the entrance, she could hear the distant hum of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter. They were waiting for their entertainment, the housemaid with the impossibly good voice, a ridiculous notion that Julian Moreno had spun into a reckless bet. The doors loomed ahead, heavy with fate. A servant ushered her in, and all at once, the room transformed into something terrifying. Chandeliers glowed above like golden constellations, illuminating the sea of the city's elite, draped in decadence. Eyes turned toward her, amused, expectant, predatory. The hum of conversation quieted as Julian rose lazily from his seat at the grand table. "Ah, the moment we've been waiting for," he announced, his voice laced with amusement. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you the unexpected talent of our own household, our dear housemaid Isabella." Mocking applause rippled through the room. Heat crawled up her neck, shame pressing into her chest like an iron weight. She searched the sea of faces, some bored, some intrigued, a few skeptical. But they were all the same, people who looked at her and saw nothing. Behind Julian, his father, Don Eduardo Moreno, barely spared her a glance before sipping his wine. This was not for his pleasure. It was for Julian's ego. Julian turned to her with a slow smirk. "The stage is yours." A servant handed her a microphone. It felt foreign in her hands, too heavy, too real. The silence thickened. This wasn't a performance. It was an execution. Julian leaned in slightly. "Well," he whispered, so only she could hear. "Sing or prove me a liar." A sharp knot of anger formed in her chest. She wasn't his puppet. She wasn't his plaything. She shut her eyes and inhaled deeply. "Sing for yourself," Marisa had said, and so she did. The first note was hesitant, barely above a whisper. The room held its breath. Then, her voice grew, like water breaking through cracked earth, like the rise of a tide against the shore. Smooth and aching, each note wove its way through the silence, turning their smirks into stillness. The song she chose was old, one her mother used to sing, a melody filled with longing, loss, and hope. She let the music carry her, pulling from the pain she had buried deep, the years of toil, the loneliness, the stolen dreams. And the room, which had gathered to mock her, fell utterly silent. Julian's smirk faded. Don Eduardo lowered his glass. Eyes softened. Some jaws even slackened. No one dared speak, dared laugh. By the time Isabella reached the final note, her voice barely above a whisper, she realized something strange. She was no longer afraid. She opened her eyes. The air was thick with something unspoken. For the first time in her life, she saw something she had never seen before in the eyes of the wealthy. Awe. She let the silence stretch, then offered a small, dignified nod. And before they could find words, before they could twist the moment back into something they controlled, she turned and walked off the stage. Julian had wanted to humiliate her. Instead, he had made her unforgettable. The night should have swallowed Isabella whole. She should have fled back to the servants' quarters, shoulders hunched in shame, feet light with the burden of insignificance. But instead, she walked through the grand hall with her head held high, a ghost of melody still lingering in the air behind her. For a few breathless seconds after she had left the stage, no one spoke. Then, like a single ember sparking into a wildfire, the applause began. It wasn't the hesitant, obligatory clapping she'd expected. It was real, raucous, enthusiastic, and most unsettling of all, it was admiring. She didn't dare stop to look back. With her pulse roaring in her ears, she ducked into a side corridor, slipping behind a large curtain where the household staff occasionally gathered unseen. She pressed a shaking hand against her chest. Was it fear that made her heart race? Or was it something more intoxicating? Her breath had yet to settle when hurried footsteps approached. "You were brilliant, Marisa." Isabella turned to find her friend's eyes wide with a mix of pride and shock. "I swear, I thought Don Eduardo would strike Julian when you started singing. He never lets him make a fool of the family, and, oh Dios mío, you did." A flicker of satisfaction curled inside Isabella, but she quickly smothered it. She had no intention of winning some invisible war against Julian Moreno. She had simply survived. And yet, as the lingering echo of her voice still danced in the grand hall, she realized something chilling. She had tasted something forbidden. Not wealth, not power, recognition. "Isabella," Marisa whispered urgently, pulling her further into the shadows. "He's coming." Julian. She barely had time to prepare herself before he swept past the curtain with the air of a man whose entire world had been thrown off course. For once, he didn't look amused. He stopped just inches away, his brows drawn together in something dangerously close to disbelief. What the hell was that? His voice was low, but not in anger. No, that was too simple. There was something else behind his tone, something far more unsettling. Shock. "You won your bet, didn't you?" she murmured, looking anywhere but at him. "You got your entertainment." Julian exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. "You don't get it." Her fists clenched. "No, you don't get it. This was never about them. Not about your father's guests, not about your stupid wager. You forced me into that spotlight expecting me to be a joke. And now you're angry because I wasn't?" His silence was damning. For all his charm and wealth, Julian Moreno had not expected to be bested by a mere housemaid, and that made Isabella dangerous. A shadow passed behind his gaze before he sighed and stepped back, his arrogance returning like a shield. "You'll sing again." The words settled in the air between them like a command. Isabella's stomach turned. No. Yes. A smug smile ghosted across his lips. Because now they want more. She wanted to scoff. She wanted to tell him that she would never let herself be put on display again. But even as the defiance surged within her, she couldn't deny one unsettling truth. somewhere deep inside, hidden beneath years of servitude. Another voice whispered, "But what if I do?" Isabella had spent her life knowing her place. She had learned it in the way doors remained closed to people like her, in the way the wealthy spoke as if she did not exist, as if the hands that cleaned their crystal and carried their silk were invisible. She had perfected the art of smallness, of shrinking herself to fit inside the narrow spaces society allowed her to occupy. But after that night, everything changed. It started subtly. The way the other servants glanced at her with something close to reverence. The murmurs that swept through the estate, whispered between passing maids and kitchen staff. Did you hear her sing? As if she had done something unnatural, something impossible. And then, the masters of the house noticed. Don Eduardo Moreno did not acknowledge her performance directly. That wasn't his way. But the next morning, the steward informed her that she was being temporarily relieved of her usual duties. At the young master's request, he had said with a neutral expression, "Julian's request." That was how she found herself standing in the sunlit music hall of the Moreno estate later that afternoon, heart pounding as she faced the man who had set this all in motion. Julian lounged carelessly against the grand piano, watching her with the lazy amusement of a cat observing a bird too naive to realize it had been caught. "You left quite an impression last night," he drawled. "I never agreed to this," she said firmly. His smirk widened. "Didn't you? You could have walked away, but you didn't." Isabella clenched her fists. "I had to sing. You didn't leave me a choice." "Exactly," he murmured, his gaze sharp as steel. "And now, there's no turning back." Her stomach twisted. "Several guests approached my father after the gala," Julian continued, stepping away from the piano. "They want to hear you again. Some of them asked if you were a professional singer before you ended up, well, here." He gestured vaguely, as if here was beneath even naming. Isabella fought to keep her voice steady. "And what did your father say?" "Nothing. Yet." Julian studied her like a puzzle, as if he was still trying to make sense of the girl who had shattered his expectations. "But I made him a proposition." Her pulse skittered. "What proposition?" Julian tilted his head, as if debating how much he wished to reveal. "There's a private gathering next week, a more exclusive crowd. If you perform there, I might convince him that you could be an asset." Isabella's breath hitched. "An asset?" she echoed bitterly. "Like a caged songbird brought out whenever the guests grow bored?" His smirk faded slightly. "You make it sound so dreadful." She glared. "It is dreadful. You don't have a better option." His voice was matter-of-fact, a reminder of the truth she hated most. No matter how many doors last night had opened, they still weren't hers to walk through freely. He stepped closer, voice lowering. "Think about it, Isabella. If you impress them, if my father sees your value, you could have a better life." Her chest tightened. A better life. Not freedom, not dignity. Just a different kind of servitude, wrapped in silk instead of dust and toil. "And if I refuse?" she challenged. Julian's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers tapped absently against the polished piano, as if weighing his response. "Then eventually," he murmured, "someone else will decide for you." The weight of his words settled like iron around her throat. Isabella had never been given choices, but now, for the first time, she faced a terrible one. Step onto that stage willingly, or be forced onto it anyway. Both were cages, but only one would let her hold the key. The grand chamber was alive with whispers, the flicker of candlelight casting golden reflections over polished mahogany and velvet-lined chairs. It was nothing like the raucous gala before. this was something greater, something darker. The guests at this gathering were not the idle, rich-seeking entertainment. They were power brokers, men and women who shaped cities with a word, who decided fates over cigars and whiskey. And tonight, they were here to witness her. Isabella stood behind the thick curtain, her pulse pounding in her throat. Her dress was not a servant's uniform tonight, but she might as well have been draped in chains. The fabric was soft, a deep burgundy, borrowed from the household wardrobe, far grander than she deserved. A gift or a mark of possession? She couldn't decide. The hum of conversation in the next room rose and fell like the tide. Among them, she knew, was Don Eduardo Moreno. His approval had not been given freely. Julian had played his game well, painting her as something rare, a curiosity worthy of display. She had seen it in the old man's gaze at dinner earlier, calculated interest, as though inspecting a fine diamond to determine if it was worth keeping. She clenched her hands into fists, hidden beneath the folds of her borrowed dress. Behind her, Julian stepped closer. "Nervous?" he murmured. Isabella did not turn to face him. "You act as though this was ever truly my choice." A soft chuckle. "It was. You just didn't like your options." Something in his voice was almost unreadable, almost regretful. But she didn't have time to make sense of it. The steward stepped forward, adjusting his coat before pushing through the heavy doors. The quiet murmurs stilled as he announced, "And now, a rare treat for our esteemed guests, an unparalleled voice, an unexpected gem within these very walls. Please welcome Señorita Isabella." A hush fell over the chamber. Julian moved beside her. For a fleeting moment, his voice lost its usual arrogance. "Sing," he murmured. "Make them remember." Her heart hammered. Then, with steady steps, she crossed the threshold. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She didn't play the docile entertainer they expected. She simply lifted her chin, took the center of the candlelit stage, and let the silence settle, stretching just long enough for uncertainty to flicker in their rich, entitled eyes. And then, she sang. It was not the fragile, uncertain melody she had given them that first night. No, this was something else. This was hers. The notes rose and fell like waves upon the shore, rich with sorrow, with longing, with all the words she had never been allowed to speak. She sang of stolen dreams, of quiet suffering, of hope buried beneath servitude. The walls of the grand chamber faded away. There were no gilded cages here, no leering nobles, no wagers placed behind smirking lips. There was only the song, and she was free. In the silence at the end was crushing. Not a single hand moved, no lazy applause, no patronizing smiles. For the first time, these men and women, these rulers of industry, these giants of wealth, had been humbled. Someone, an elder statesman in the back, rose to his feet. Slow, awed. Then another, until at last applause erupted, not as amusement, but as something far rarer, as respect. Isabella stood tall. Her chest rose and fell in steady breaths, though her soul was still lost somewhere within the notes she had given them. She had not performed for them. She had made them listen. As she turned to leave the stage, she caught Julian's gaze from where he stood near the column. His expression had shifted. He was no longer the arrogant young heir, pleased at a bet well played. He was watching something he no longer controlled. She walked past him without a word, and for once, it was Julian Moreno who had nothing to say. That night, as the others drank and debated what to make of their unexpected discovery, Isabella slipped out into the cool evening air. the scent of night jasmine wrapping around her like an old friend. Marisa was waiting for her outside, arms crossed, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "So?" she asked. "Are you staying?" Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the wind against her skin, the taste of possibility at the edges of her world. She thought of all the ways they had tried to shape her, to own her talent as if it were theirs to use. And she thought of the song still living inside her. "No," she whispered. Then, with nothing but the moon as her witness, she walked away from the estate, from the gilded walls of her former life, and into a future that she would choose. For the first time, the voice of the housemaid belonged only to herself. If this powerful story of resilience and self-discovery moved you, don't miss out on more captivating tales of courage and triumph. Subscribe to our channel today by clicking the button below and join our growing community of storytellers and dreamers. Enable notifications to stay updated on new stories that celebrate the strength of the human spirit, the pursuit of dreams, and the unexpected ways life can change in an instant. Each week, we bring you deeply emotional and inspiring narratives that remind us all: no dream is too small, and no voice should go unheard. Your support helps us continue sharing these remarkable stories. Click subscribe now and be part of a journey where ordinary people rise above expectations and claim their destiny.